Hey guys, Sarthak here, and this is True Calling. Been out for about 2 weeks, finishing up with my grad program at UT Austin, so have not had the time to address any conversations, put out podcasts. But this felt timely in some ways, considering there was an attack in Kashmir, and my hearts definitely go out to anyone that lost their life, families, loved ones. Kashmir's obviously had a conflict. It's one of the most militarized zones, and it's one of the longest standing conflicts in the world right now. So, even though this does not seem new, it should not be something that repeats itself. Myself, my family being from Kashmir, it affects me personally, which is why I decided to put this podcast out. This is something that was recorded much earlier, actually. This was recorded in 2021 when I first had the idea of starting this podcast and recording some conversations. So, to cut to the chase, this conversation is with Dr. Saiba Varma, who is an associate professor at UC San Diego studying anthropology. And her anthropological work has been while living in Kashmir, in the Indian occupied Kashmir, and documenting her journey and research on the relationship between military involvement and healthcare in the valley. And this might be a not so common view, at least from the listeners of this podcast, and might be a little bit of a contrarian take on what's actually happening. Things might have changed since 2021, but I decided to, anyways, put this out because it does highlight some questions that we need to think through as citizens of the world, and when conflicts come close to our home, it really hits us hard as well. So we discussed about trauma, the mental health of the average population there, uh, things she kind of found to be surprising. Um, and yeah, I hope that you get something out of it. I really want to know your thoughts about this conversation. If there's anything that you think you disagree with, agree with, it's just a perspective, but a perspective that can be stole from someone that decided to spend some time understanding the culture and what's happening on the ground. So I hope you guys enjoy the conversation and see you guys soon. All right. Welcome to True Calling. Just to start off, can you just give a brief introduction of who you are, and what field you're into right now?
Okay, sure. Yeah. My name is Saiba Varma. I am an assistant professor in the anthropology department at UCSD, and I'm also an affiliate faculty in the global health program and the science studies program.
Awesome, awesome. And how did you get into anthropology?
Yeah. So I think I think it's sort of connected to my life history. I grew up, my father was an Indian diplomat. So we moved around every like 3 or 4 years to a different country. He was actually like a expert in China. So we lived many years in like East Asia, Hong Kong, China, Bangladesh. And I think that experience kind of growing up made me very acutely aware of my own identity and how unstable identities really are, right? So, when I would go back to India, my cousins and everyone they wouldn't really think I was Indian, but of course, neither was I Chinese, and I was going to American schools, and neither was I American. And that feeling of just cultural kind of dislocation was something that was just a part of my life, but I never had a language to really understand it until I came to college in the US. And then I took an anthropology class just on a whim. I didn't even know what it was. I just thought it was a cool sounding word. And so I just took it. And that class kind of blew my mind because it was the first time where I realized, oh, there's actually a language. And other people have also written about and talked about these experiences of identity, kind of cultural dislocation, what it means to belong to a particular place or not belong, how kind of complex these things are. And so I sort of, I fell in love with the discipline, although I still didn't really believe that I could like be an anthropologist. That seemed like something out of a movie.
I'm still, as you said, that word seems fancy. Can we
Yeah.
break down that word? Can we please break down the word? What is anthropology?
Sure, yeah. So anthropology, so the word anthro means like human, and logos means study or logic, actually, right? But study. So it's like the study of human beings. So anthropology is really about like, I know that sounds really broad. It is about the study of human culture, we could say. And there are different fields of anthropology. So there's, archaeology, like the people who dig up, right? Like the history of human civilizations. There's biological anthropology, which is about human evolution. And then there's what I do, which is cultural anthropology, which is studying contemporary societies. And I'm a medical anthropologist, so I'm really interested in the ways in which different cultures think about medicine, healing, the body in culturally specific ways. So, as an anthropologist, you can basically work anywhere in the world as long as they're human beings. You can study them.
And what is medical anthropology specifically?
So medical anthropology it's a subfield of cultural anthropology. You kind of study the relationship between health, medicine, the body, and culture. So, for example, you could study something like how new reproductive technologies have reshaped ideas of gender. Or you could study how, like in my case, I study the relationship between mental health and culture. So how, for example, conflict, long-term violence or conflict reshapes culture in a community, how ideas of trauma are translated by different groups to make it sort of culturally meaningful to them, and how they learn to cope and survive in those kinds of conditions.
Got it. And so this is the perfect segue then into how did you end up in Kashmir? I'm very, very curious, and we have a lot to unwrap, and there's so much, but how did you end up in Kashmir and start off with that?
Yeah. So I went to Kashmir as a child, sort of before the kind of insurgency conflict really started. And it left like a strong impression on me, even as a child, just because it's visually, it's a really, really beautiful place. And then I sort of like, it kind of moved to the back of my mind, but like every Indian it's always present, right? It's ever present. It's hard to sort of convey, I think, to non-Indians how kind of central Kashmir is to the imagination, right? But it's always there. So when I entered grad school, I was really interested, sort of the rise of Hindu nationalism. And I was very interested in Hindu nationalism and sort of thinking about what this wave of anti-Muslim violence really meant for this supposedly kind of secular and democratic country. I was like really disturbed by the genocide that had happened in Gujarat and things like that. So I knew my general kind of research interest was around violence and thinking about how violence reshapes communities, how people learn to live and respond and cope with, that kind of really extraordinary situation. I started kind of reading up about different conflicts in South Asia. I wanted to work somewhere where I have language proficiency, because that's really important as an anthropologist. We don't like work in a lab. We go and we live in communities for like a year or 2 years. We immerse ourselves.
How long were you there for?
So I lived there for 18 months for my dissertation fieldwork. And so I started reading up about different conflicts, and I started reading about Kashmir, and, everything that I was reading was written from either a kind of Indian nationalist perspective or a Pakistani nationalist perspective, and a very kind of security studies sort of framework where it was like, Kashmir is a problem, and we have to solve it. And how do we solve it? And as an anthropologist, those are not really the questions that interest me, I'm much more interested in like people's everyday lives, and what does it mean to actually live in the world's longest running conflict, one of the world's most militarized places. Like, what is your everyday life like? And so I decided to go there. This was like in 2007 or 8. I decided to just go as a preliminary trip and see if I could talk to people, and what they were sort of experiencing, whether they would be open to someone like me doing research there. And I happened to meet some psychiatrists who basically told me that, that they were dealing with what they called an epidemic of trauma, of post-traumatic stress, anxiety, depression, different kinds of mental health issues that were directly related to this kind of unending conflict in their minds, because people just had no certainty, right, about the future, about even tomorrow. Is tomorrow going to be a curfew? Is it going to be a lockdown? No idea. And they said, this is the main issue we're dealing with. This is the public health crisis, and this is what you should work on. And so I really took my cue from them. And this is something really important for me as a researcher, is I want to produce research that is socially meaningful to the people that I'm working with. They're not just objects of my study, but I want to think about how is this research going to be useful for people there? And so I decided that that's what I was going to focus on, because they basically told me that that was the most urgent thing that was happening.
Very interesting. Couple of things here. You said most things written before or talked about Kashmir were either from this Indian nationalist point of view or Pakistani nationalist point of view. Yeah. And it was more about solving something. Yeah. Can we say that, the way you kind of think of things, the way anthropologists think of things, are more about the situation rather than a solution? It's more about just going deeper into the area rather than looking for solutions. You're looking at the actual case, what is actually happening on the ground.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. I would say that it's not that we're not interested in solutions, but it's this idea that through really understanding how people on the ground are theorizing and are thinking about their situation, then we can kind of get to a solution, right?
Yeah.
But we can't kind of impose a solution from the outside, and expect that, suddenly it's going to work, which is what most of these interventions, that's how they actually operate.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're going to start talking a lot about Kashmir. You have this book out. It's called The Occupied Clinic, Militarism and Care in Kashmir. And, I wanted to ask you, because you, across the book, you kind of, the main theme is militarized care in some sense. Could you explain to readers, or just even to me, what, according to you, militarized care really means? The broad scope of what that means.
Sure. Yeah. So, okay, so I think it operates at several different levels, right? But at the broadest level, I think what I am trying to argue is that the problem is that basically Indians and in the Indian state have overinvested in Kashmir as a region that they are emotionally invested in, they are militarily over-invested in, they are economically over-invested in. So they've both sort of, there's all this imagination of Kashmir as this integral part of India. It's even called a toot ang, an integral limb of India, right? And its position at the crown of the Indian nation. So the idea that, if Kashmir is not ours, then we're decapitating Bharat Mata or Mother India, right? There's all of this very loaded imagery of how and why Kashmir is an integral part of India, and that this idea that we must love Kashmir. To be a good Indian, you must love Kashmir, and it is not even sayable. It is not even, you cannot even question that, right? That would be seditious to even question whether or not Kashmir belongs to India. And at the same time, right, while there's a sort of public kind of love, overly, I would say a kind of an obsession over Kashmir, at the same time, right, there has been a military kind of overinvestment in keeping Kashmir part of India. There's been decades and decades of suppression of voices from Kashmir who have argued for self-determination, for independence, demands that predate the creation of India and Pakistan. We can go back to the 90s and you have a quit Kashmir movement, right?
So that was Sheikh Abdullah, is that?
Yeah, Sheikh Abdullah, exactly, yeah. And you can even go back further. I mean, one of the really interesting things that I discovered in my research was that, it's not just the kind of India and Pakistan and China sort of fight over Kashmir. This is not new. Kashmiris actually see themselves as colonized for more than 450 years. Like they trace it back to the Mughals. That's the last time a Kashmiri ruler was leading, was in Kashmir. And so for them, this is a 450-year-long struggle of colonization. Anyway, I'm digressing, but so there's all this Indian love, care for Kashmir, right? But what underpins it, I think, is this sense that this belongs to us, that there is an exchange. We will overinvest in you economically. We will give you all this humanitarian assistance, etc., in exchange for you being loyal to us, in exchange for you to belong to us, right? And that's very rarely acknowledged, I think, in Indian public discourse. It's usually this logic of like, we've given you so much. Why are you still ungrateful? Why are you still causing all these problems?
This is what my parents say to me, by the way. I'll just give you a quick background. My dad was actually born in the hospital that you talk about in the book as well, and my mom was also within Srinagar. And it's very interesting to me because when I listen to the narrative that my parents tell me, because they also in 90s, they're Kashmiri Pandits, and so they were exiled from that whole place, so they moved to Delhi. And that whole time, now when I talk to them, anytime I ask them anything about that whole situation, it is always this specific, this specific narrative that, hey, we were kicked out of this place and it's because of these people, and these people are ungrateful for all that's happened. They're still ungrateful. India's helping them out so much. They're still ungrateful. And whereas when you really look at outside of that, their own narrative, then it's a completely different story. It's the opposite way. And so I'm always so confused about, what is really true, because their experience is so different from what most people talk about.
Yeah. No, it's very true. And it's so complex, right? I mean, there have been these waves of sort of deliberate fomenting of communalization, like religious differences. And there's so much bitterness, right? Yeah. And understandably, because there's a lot of trauma on both sides, definitely. But I think like what gets missed, what I realized, right, is that it's not this pure altruistic love that is being given, that love has always been, right,
politically motivated.
Absolutely politically motivated, and as a form of suppression of pro self-determination ideas in the valley, right? That we can stamp out any desire for independence, any desire for self-determination if we just buy people's loyalty. Nehru called this like the golden chains, actually, in the 1950s. And I think that's part of the story that a lot of people miss, is that this love and care has been, that's why I call it militarized care, is because it's always been accompanied with this very heavy military hand. This severe military repression has been a feature of Indian rule in Kashmir for 70 years, So it's mixed up together. Like on the one hand, we say, oh, we love you and, you belong to us. And then on the other hand, we enact the most brutal tactics of militarization, often in the world, right? If you kind of look back and think Kashmir is the site of, it's now the most densely militarized place in the world's longest communication blackout, like there's so many ways in which it's become this kind of exceptional site where Indian democracy has never, ever really taken root the way that it's taken place in other places, because they don't trust Kashmiris. That's the truth. They don't trust people there to actually have agency and have a voice.
It's so interesting to me because, going back to you were talking earlier about, much before this, about Kashmir being, the crown of, and this insane, altruism, but this kind of hidden motive behind that altruism. It's a story. It's a fascinating story. I live in Delhi, so when I was studying in ICSE board, there's two main boards, right? CBSE and ICSE in India. And I remember very clearly, we had in our geography class, when we used to do maps, we were shown the map of India. And this is something fascinating because I got to know about this 2 years ago during college. I clearly remember the map of India, the part of Kashmir being this massive piece of land in the map. This whole, it kind of engulfing most of what you look at now as Pakistan occupied Kashmir as well. And I never questioned it because, it's the map. Now we're just looking at the map the way it is. Come to college, a year later, me and my friend were talking about this issue because, of course, it's been running since this whole time. It's been still going on. He says, hey, by the way, I don't know if you've noticed, but the map that they showed probably to you in school is probably not the actual map that the world recognizes. And then I searched up on Google Maps, I searched up the map, and the map that there is like the one they showed us was literally all of the Pakistani occupied Kashmir also as part of Indian occupied Kashmir. And this is what we are being taught in our education system as well. And so this is such an insane thing to me because it's not just drilled down, yeah, and like it's not just within our parents. It's like the education system, the youth that's coming in is also with the same mentality of this is what Kashmir is, this is what it should be, and that is just insane to me.
Yeah, it is really insane. Right, because it is such an erasure of the actual history of that region, and also just a complete erasure of what people in that region want and what they have been aspiring to. So, the other way in which I'm thinking about this idea of militarized scare, right, is that every time Kashmiris have tried to assert that they want self-determination, they want the chance to determine their own future, their own control over their own region, their own land, it has always been misread as, oh, you just want more development. You just want more money. You just want more aid. And then money gets kind of thrown at them. Like there's this really classic statement that Modi made a few years ago where he said, stone pelters, we just need to replace the stones with laptops. Basically like saying that, yeah, like these people there's no legitimate basis to what they are calling for. And that really what they want is more care, more development, more integration. And frankly, that just has not worked. And what we're saying is that is being forced down people's throats now, even more post-August 2019, post the revocation, instead of what I would hope for, which is this really fundamental questioning of like people have not changed what they have been asking for the last 70 years, or you could go back 450 years. In fact, their voices are only getting more and more clear as the oppression gets more and more severe. Their demands get more and more crystallized. So when are we going to actually listen to them? When are we going to say like, this is not working?
Since you've been in the middle of, you've stayed there for an extended amount of time, like can you give all of us a better understanding of what it was to on an everyday basis, on a daily basis, witnessing the actual situation there?
Yeah, so again, like as an Indian, it is really shocking, right? It is not at all what you expect. So the first thing that really strikes you, I think, is just the level of militarization in the region. You cannot walk down the street without encountering soldier after soldier after soldier, bunkers in neighborhoods, checkpoints, huge tracts of land taken over by the army, or taken over by paramilitary forces. It is, I think the first thing that hits you is just the extent of this kind of militarized apparatus. And in these very intimate spaces, right? We're talking about like kids walking to school and you are passing soldiers with guns, staring down at you every day. So that's, I think, the most kind of obvious level where you sense that, something is wrong, right? And no one buys that those soldiers are there to keep people
safe.
Kashmiri safe. People have nicknamed, they're called security forces and people call them insecurity forces. Because of course, it's like they don't belong there. Yeah. They are not there to keep people safe. They are there because they think that the people who live in this region are dangerous, are terrorists, that the people don't belong there, right? It's that kind of idea. And then on top of that, you have this constant kind of disturbance of everyday life where, even though by the Indian Army's own accounts, there are no more than 100 active militants in the whole valley. Okay. And this has been the case for the last about 8 years, or let's say 500. Okay. Maximum. Let's say there are 500 active militants. You still have 100,000 troops stationed there fighting 500 militants. Like in what world, does that make sense? That is invariably going to lead to conflicts, to skirmishes, to protests kind of exploding. So, that is what's happened, right, over the last decade or so, that the movement has become very much a non-violent movement, a movement that's based on civil disobedience, like the very techniques that the Indian state
used against the British,
those are being wielded, and yet because it's such a militarized place, the Indian state, their only response is a military response. They cannot distinguish between protesters and terrorists. To them, everyone is a terrorist, everyone is a potential criminal. And so you have this heavy-handed response by the state, and then of course people come up and protest, right? And then you just have this cyclical kind of violence without any end to it, any resolution. So you can imagine just psychologically growing up in that kind of situation, living in that kind of place.
I don't think I can even imagine, probably. It's a crazy place to live in. It's also like, again, I get this back to kind of my parents, because it's like most of the accounts of what I've heard about, and this is something very interesting, because what they used to say was, as kids, when they used to grow up, they all lived, it was all very peaceful as kids. So this is probably talking about like 1970s. At that time, as when they were, Hindus, Muslims, all intermingling, everything, it was totally fine. And somewhere there, there's a complete switch which happened. And I know you've given a lot of the details in the book, of like meeting specific people, specific patients, like all kinds of horrific things have happened. Could you give the listeners more details of what is something that you witnessed? Maybe like what could be you could consider as like the lowest point of your trip there in Kashmir? Like,
wow.
Something that really like emotionally triggered you, and you really thought about it.
Yeah, I think I think the hardest, one of the hardest, there were a lot of really hard moments, right? Because not only was I like in this, like militarized, occupied space, although I should say that, because I was an outsider, I was never physically in danger. This was like also, this was also something I had to keep like telling my family in Delhi and stuff, because they'd be like,
right.
What are you doing there? And come back. And, the minute there would be any little disturbance, it'd be like, you better get back here and stuff. And I wanted to tell them. And in the book, I say, I feel so much more unsafe in Delhi than I do in Kashmir. Like, it's not even a contest. In Kashmir, I'm like sort of untouchable. The security forces are not going to do anything to me because they know I'm Indian. And all my Kashmiri friends are so protective of me that like they would never let anything happen to me. I've never been in the middle of a protest, in the middle of a stone pelting, like never. They've always taken like care to make sure that I was safe, So Delhi, like taking an auto at night, I'm more scared than like, being in the center of this militarized space, which tells you also a lot about like the humanity that people still have there, the care that they still have, this like I write about it in the book, but this sense
Mehman Nawazi.
Yeah, just like deep sense of hospitality, and which like, good luck to find that in Delhi, right? Like we know that's kind of like impossible. So, I mean, coming back to your question, I think one of the hardest moments for me was I was there in 2016 when basically the Indian military had, they had gotten a lot of negative kind of international press for the last few years because they had used live ammunition on civilians. 2010, 2011, like they had killed like 120 civilians in each of those protests. And so they decided to shift to what they call non-lethal or less lethal weapons.
The pellet gun?
Yeah, so it's like things like tear gas, but the new weapon that they really introduced were these basically shotguns, what you call shotguns in the US. They're pump action shotguns. And so each cartridge holds like 500 pellets, which are like these lead coated pellets, right?
Interesting.
And the way that they work is you release like a cartridge and they disperses in a very unpredictable manner. So it's very hard to have accuracy with these weapons. But, they're like imbued with all of this moral language about being more modern kinds of warfare, more humanitarian kinds of warfare. We're not trying to kill people. Yes, we might wound them, but it's better than killing them, this kind of logic, right? And so when the protest broke out after Burhan Wani was killed in 2016, they used these non-lethal weapons, right, en masse, and it caused devastating harm. Like more than 15,000 people were badly wounded by these weapons. Like dozens of people were blinded. Some were blinded in both eyes. And the problem with the pellets is that they produce wounds all over the body. And so for doctors, it's not like a bullet wound where you can easily identify, okay, this is the wound and we can begin treating it. With pellets, you have to do all these body scans to find out which organ has been perforated, like where is the damage. It just makes the whole process of care like a lot more complicated. And this is already in a place where like your public health resources are like so under-resourced anyway. And so anyway, I was there during all of this happening, and I decided to go to the hospital and try to interview some of these pellet patients. And it was just like rows and rows of young people, young men, like 97% of people who were wounded were young men, you know, in their teens and 20s, with these just bruises, wounds all over their bodies, bandages because their eyes had been hit. They were so scared to speak to me. You know, I had never really encountered, like, people usually were like pretty open to talking to me when I was doing research. But people were so scared to speak because there were all of these cops in the hospital in disguise, trying to find out who the pellet patients were so that then they could be like detained or arrested or whatever, brought in for interrogation later. And people were terrified of even speaking to anybody because they were afraid that they would be booked. And these are kids who have like their whole bodies are like wounded, you know, and that was like really difficult. That was a moment that I really questioned like myself. I questioned like, what am I doing here as a researcher? What can I possibly offer people? Like, it just seemed like the scale of the violence and the brutality of it was like really overwhelming.
Apart from the brutality, are there any stories, or do you from that have you learned just more about yourself as a person, you know, just being there? Like, what have you learned from all these interactions you've had with people, apart from, so you say at some point, you say in the book, you say terror and compassion economies collide with the most tragic effect in the clinic. I first wanted to like go deeper into that.
Yeah, so what I was trying to say with that was basically just that, you know, the clinic is a space where you both kind of see the harms that militarism produces, right? Like, such as these wounds, right? These sometimes untreatable wounds that the state is insisting is a form of care, and that they're insisting, no, this is actually, we're doing a humanitarian kind of warfare. Like, even after these reports of 15,000 people being wounded, the Indian Supreme Court, what was their response? They were like, we need more non-lethal weapons. We just need different kinds of non-lethal. Let's do like chili bombs, and let's get like these lasers. And that was their response, right? So that's the sort of terror economy that I'm talking about. And the compassion economy is that, you know, medicine is supposed to be the space of care, right? It's supposed to provide some kind of antidote. It's supposed to like stitch up wounds. It's supposed to heal people, or at least try to. But within these kinds of militarized conditions, it's impossible. It becomes impossible. Medicine cannot function the way that it's supposed to. In these conditions, just the example I gave you of cops infiltrating the hospital, trying to track patients, right? How is care supposed to happen in that situation? How are people supposed to feel safe in a space like the clinic, right? So that was sort of what I was trying to say, was that these spaces that are supposed to be protective, that are supposed to be neutral, that are supposed to be caring, they also become sort of totally taken over by the military apparatus. They're not able to like stand up to the military apparatus.
Wow. And then you kind of go towards the end of the book, you kind of go into, in the epilogue, I think you say that you describe this scene where you're looking for a rickshaw and to go to SMHS.
Yeah.
Could you like just just unfold that whole scene and like the reflection you have that moment? Because that's something very interesting.
Yeah, sorry, and I realized I didn't answer your previous question about how it's changed me as a person.
Right.
So
I mean, this is kind of I feel like this question kind of goes into that. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, the epilogue is kind of I wrote it, it's sort of a fantasy in a way. I mean, it actually happened, but you know, there's a moment in which I imagine the rickshaw kind of taking off, and like it's like flying through the air kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like looking over the city. But basically that scene is it takes place during these protests I was describing in 2016. And, there was a sense of like, as a researcher, you don't know what to do in that situation. You're like, should I go to the hospital? Everything is shut down. Everything is curfew. There is no public transportation. There's like, life is like completely still, right?
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, what is my job right now? Am I supposed to just sit at home and watch old Hindi movies on TV and experience the stillness? Is that research? Yeah. Or am I supposed to push myself and go to the clinic and try to do whatever interviews I can do and see what is happening there, right? So in this moment, I decided on the latter. Like, I was going to be this brave, field worker, and I was going to like cut through the curfew and I was going to go. And as I described, like, even finding an auto who was like willing to take me right across the city when everything was totally shut down was itself, not only was I putting myself at risk, but I was also putting them at risk in doing that. And that was something that made me really realize like the stakes of research in a different way, that someone was like agreeing to risk his life, because if our auto would have been stopped, he would have been hurt, not me. Right. Like he could have been.
So did they always know? Sorry, did they always know like you were not like an insider, like you were not Kashmiri? Did they always could they tell?
Yeah, they could tell. Yeah, pretty much.
Interesting.
Yeah. Like the security guards would say, like, they'd be like, "Madam, like, what are you doing here? Why are you here?" Like, I didn't make sense to them in any kind of logic. They could kind of think maybe I was a journalist, but I didn't have any of the press passes or any of that stuff. Right. But anyway, that moment of sort of realizing, we are in this together, that we are tied together in this moment of risk, where he is like agreeing out of a sense of duty to me because he knows me and he's taken me many times. Yeah. He's taking me in this, he's taking this risk for me. And it made me really question, okay, why am I doing this work? Like, why do I feel pulled and obligated to do this work in this moment? What am I trying to say with my work? And yeah, I think like it's been so challenging working there in so many ways, because it's meant that I have to completely unlearn everything I was taught, basically, right? About India, about history of India, about Kashmir, about Muslim people, like all of these things that we kind of carry with us. It's meant like to deeply challenge and deeply undo all of that. And in the end, I think it's just made me so much more aware of other kinds of narratives that circulate like that, and to really question, like, what are we being told about a certain place, about a certain kind of people, and what might some other possibilities be? It sort of really shattered my faith in like these kind of dominant forms of knowledge that we are all, that we all receive. And in the end, I think it made me so much more aware, so much more, like you said, compassionate, empathetic, just open-minded, willing to be challenged on the things that I think I know,
What is the message that you would give to the youth of not just of India, of everywhere in the world? Because we see this is a common theme across everywhere in the world. Currently in the US, but just what happened right now, previously, 2 days ago. I mean, it is fascinating to me that there is such a different. People have so many different perspectives, but the biggest thing that I see that most people seem to not have is open-mindedness and being open to someone else's perspective, because you really never know the truth until you go and look for it, kind of, right? Which is what you did actually in the valley.
Yeah. I think, and, yes, and social media makes that a lot worse, right? Because it's controlling everything that we're seeing. It's reinforcing our narratives, what we already know, and it's never going to show you the other side. Yeah.
Right.
I do have like I get a lot of kind of inspiration and strength and energy from like, your generation. I love teaching undergrads. Like I get like a lot of joy out of that, because I just feel like there is still that willingness to learn, that there isn't this, I know everything,
Right.
There's a sense of like, you can see the light bulbs go off and you can see people being like, oh my God, like this was a lie. And now I know a better way of thinking about something. So, I do get a lot of hope from that. I think my message would be that like the levels of inequality that we are dealing with, just even on a global scale, are just so unprecedented. Like 50% of the world's wealth is controlled by 8 people. That is like
Right.
insane.
Yeah.
The level of militarization that we are dealing with is unprecedented. The military spending has actually increased over the last year, even in the middle of a pandemic, rather than those resources being shifted to public health and stuff. And so I would just say that there's so much injustice. There are so many ways in which people can become more aware, become more engaged, that I just want people to sort of get off social media and actually get into it, like get into the mud and
action more than this is something that we recently talked about with my friends here too, because the day that the Capitol building, this whole protesting happened, I saw for hours and hours everyone in the house and everyone around was just on their phone, just looking at the news and responding to Instagram and whatnot. So much of what we do, this is something that I want to ask you as well, but so much of what we do is reaction rather than action. It's a lot of reacting to things rather than acting. So you would say that acting upon those things is more important, and that's something we should do more.
I think so. I mean, there is a place for social media activism for sure. Like, even if I look at the history of protests in Kashmir, people's ability to organize on social media it's been so important. The Arab Spring, like, it's been really important in decentralizing the movement and making the movements more democratic, having like them be actually youth-led movements. Like, there's a place for that, but I don't think anything can replace bodies together, like working towards a goal. I think there's just something so powerful about that. And I'm really worried about, the ways in this like social isolation, if they become more permanent, if people start becoming even more isolated from each other, even more atomized. Now we're being told that we should be scared of everyone who's walking down the street, walk away. I do that too. Like, we move away from them. And I think that's a really devastating kind of thing, because we need human contact.
Connection,
we need that
contact.
We need to build relationships. That is the only way we're going to make change, and I just think like everyone should be doing that in their own little way. Everyone should be kind of thinking about how is it that you want to contribute.
Wow, that's fascinating. Kind of, I know that even the way you've written your book, it's very there's a lot of literature, poems, and it's very interesting actually. I would really recommend people read the book, because even the start, the letter to no one, all that is such a beautiful way of writing the whole thing. What are some, I asked this to all my guests now, what are some book recommendations that you have for maybe all of us, maybe 3 book recommendations that kind of change your perspective about things in a positive way? Some books, like books that kind of fiction, non-fiction way.
Yeah. What a great question. Let me think. Okay, I think one book, like my favorite novel of maybe like all time, is a book called The Tale for a Time Being. Okay. And it's basically 2 stories kind of interwoven. It's just like a schoolgirl in Japan and her story, and then it's a writer who's like living in Canada and it's her story. But the book it like weaves together these stories so beautifully, and it's a lot about reflecting on time, the passing of time, and it moves between different time periods as well. And it's kind of like, I'm really interested in Buddhism, and so it gives you certain kinds of ideas, like Buddhist ideas, like, for example, the idea of interdependence, right? How we are all connected to each other, which is something that's like sort of, it's easy to like talk about, right? But to actually remember that we are not individuals, and that we are actually like all of our being is like deeply connected, and we affect each other in such profound ways that we don't even realize the ways in which we affect each other. It conveys that idea in a way where you don't even realize that that's what you're taking in, because it does it so subtly, but it's kind of infused with those like really beautiful sort of ideas about human life. I'm trying to think. I feel like I should recommend an ethnography.
Yes, please. Yes.
I read this really beautiful. Oh, actually, okay, I know what I'm going to recommend. There's this really great book called Bomb Children, and it is about. I know that sounds like
a beautiful book about
it's a
bombing
really
children.
beautiful book. It's about Laos, and it's about the U.S. the secret war in Laos, and about all of these basically undetonated bombs that were left in Laos after the war, and how people are like living in this landscape with all of these undetonated bombs that like some bombs could go off at any moment. But in some ways, in some cases, they've turned the bombs into like playgrounds. Like the bombs like are like shells, and they like kids play on them and stuff like that.
Oh, wow.
And so it's kind of about the aftermath of war and how people kind of live in that landscape. And that book also has a lot of poems in it. Like it's not a traditional ethnographic book at all. And it's really lovely. And then the final book I will recommend is a book by Saadia Hartman called Wayward Lives. And it's set in like the early 20th century. And it's about the first generation of sort of Black women who left the slave like plantations and moved to the city to try to like build new lives for themselves, like, you know, have work, like live kind of free, right? Like free lives. And it's about their romantic relationships, their intimacies. But because she's a historian, but because she's not able to find a lot in the archive about like the happy parts of their lives, because everything that's in the archive are like police records or, you know, people being thrown into like institutions or whatever. She uses fiction. So she kind of imagines a lot of like what their lives would have been like where they went dancing, like, you know, who they had like romantic flings with, like all of these kinds of things. So it's a way of imagining people's lives in a like
optimistic. I have a question. A question with regards to this, because even when you write this book, towards the end, you kind of talk about this, about making the ending, happier, as with regards to the whole book being somber and very, very real, insanely horrid description of things. Do you think that why do we do that as a human species? Why do we look for why do we always need a positive ending to everything? You know, like, do you think there's like a deeper kind of thing into that? Like, why can't we be fine with having, because in cases that doesn't happen in reality, sometimes you just don't have a happy ending to a lot of things. Is it just the human, like the positive, you know, the optimistic human in us that wants to see that? Like, what is it? What do you think it is?
You know, I think, well, part of it is also that it's not true, right? Like that usually it's not one note. Like it's not either sad or it's happy. Usually we have there's a really complex set of feelings that we have, and about any kind of situation, and especially like these kind of life and death situations. And so, you know, I think there's a kind of danger of, especially when we're talking about people really far away, of sort of victimizing or portraying them as these like helpless victims who are only suffering, and, you know, they need our help. Like we will, you know, we are like the ones who are capable of doing something, and so we will go and like save them, right? This whole kind of savior mentality that I think a lot of people, you know, even like with good intentions, but I think that's really problematic, is like reducing people's lives to just, these are just poor suffering people, you know, in the third world or whatever.
Right. So what would you say is a better way of looking at it then? Because I think that the other end of it as well, which is the victim mentality, like thinking of yourself as a victim, it also is detrimental to your health.
Really detrimental. Yeah.
So absolutely. What do you think is just somewhere in the middle? What do you think is the kind of the better ground then?
I think that, you know, I think we have to hold both things, right? So I think like we have to be able to kind of really understand the violence that these forces can inflict on people's lives, right? And the harms and the way that they can like tear people's lives apart. Like I think that's like very real, and we should grapple with that. That is really important. But at the same time, we have to kind of also understand that people are surviving, they are coping, they are struggling, they are like they are still making jokes, they're still eating food, they're still watching TV, they're still hanging out with each other, they're still laughing, playing, that all of that is also as real as any of the suffering. And so I tried in the book to kind of thread those things together as much as I could, to say, like, this is not like, Kashmiris don't need our pity. That is not what this is about. What they need is our solidarity. But real
solidarity, real, not this sense of solidarity that the government is kind of producing as well, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't even call that solidarity.
Right.
Yeah, it's right. Like they need people to speak with them, not for them, not at them, right? So that's kind of how I think about it, right? Is that like, we can do justice. We should still be able to have we should still be able to care about people even when they're not perfect, when they have all these complex feelings and they are full of contradictions, because we're all full of contradictions. None of us are perfect. And yet all of us are deserving of dignity, right? I think that's kind of what it comes down to.
Very interesting. And my last question, which I again ask, is it going to be a permanent question? It's kind of like a philosophical thing, but since you said you're also into Buddhism, what, according to you, what is the meaning of a life?
I think like, I don't think it's some kind of thing that's like out there, that's like inaccessible, or it's like really abstract. I think life is like what we do every day. It's in our everyday practice, in our kind of everyday cultivation of wisdom, of compassion, like just practicing those things, like what we were talking about earlier, practicing open-mindedness, practicing like kindness, right? Stretching ourselves a little bit further and seeing like, okay, I'm having this like negative reaction to this thing, and it's making me really upset, but can I like have a different reaction to it? Or can I ask myself, like, why am I feeling this way? I think the more we I think life is like practice. It's like, we have to just keep at it. We will make mistakes, we will fail, but the more we can sort of practice compassion, the more we can practice wisdom, learning like the things that are in our control and the things that are not in our control. I think that's what it's about for me, at least. That's what I want to keep pushing myself to be a more and more ethical person. I don't think I'm there yet at all. I'm still learning.
Right. That's awesome. I also have another question actually, but I kind of wanted to go more into this, I guess. Like what we do every day obviously defines what we become, right?
Exactly.
Like all these practices that we're doing. My question is slightly more in the most psychology kind of direction. You see, like there's all kinds of people around the world. There's people who, like in Kashmir and actual high conflict zones that are experiencing this, but there's also people on a daily basis who get triggered by everything, like triggered by the smallest of things on a daily basis. They've recently there's so many people in the US itself who face depression, who face all these kind of mental problems. What is your this is slightly this is something which I've recently kind of gotten aware about, which is the idea of outside of medicines, people have been using more psychedelic treatment within US as a way of kind of understanding. And what the recent study which came out said that apparently, the using psilocybin or psilocybin, however you say it, has been 4 times more effective than any other depression medicines that they've used on people. What do you think about the usage of psychedelics and those kind of getting these natural plants into everyday medical treatment?
I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think it's been suppressed for so long for really really kind of racist and corporate reasons, right? Like the same reason why marijuana has been criminalized, whereas alcohol was not, was very much based on kind of racist assumptions of who uses marijuana and who drinks and stuff like that. I think like these drugs, and I'll add something to this, but I think what they do is they open up people's imaginations. That's the most important thing that they do. And I think that can be a profound like response to something like depression. One way of thinking about depression is aside from the sort of neurobiological thing, but if we kind of want to think about it sort of philosophically, I think depression is a feeling of being stuck, right? It's a feeling of like not knowing what to do, not knowing where to go. And one response to that can be creativity, right? And so how do we like open up people's creativities? How do we give space for people to imagine? You know, this is something that like I saw in Kashmir all the time, right? Like people are unable to imagine their future because it's impossible. They're so stuck, you know, in this present kind of situation. But as soon as you let them imagine, and when they do imagine, it sort of opens up so many possibilities, right? It like frees you from your kind of current like situation. It takes you out of your own body in a way.
Right.
So I do think that, you know, it makes a lot of sense. Having said that, I don't think that there's any kind of magic bullet. I don't think like there's a miracle drug that's going to cure these psychological problems, because for me as an anthropologist, psychological problems are fundamentally social problems. And by that, I mean that there is some sort of course, there's a biological basis to something like depression, but I think there is an equally important social and political basis, an economic basis to something like depression. So, you know, I was reading a study about how there's something like 87% of Americans right now are experiencing anxiety.
Right.
Now that is
a huge number.
Shocking. That is like the majority of the population. So either we approach all of those people as individuals and treat their kind of individual problems, or we step back and we say, what is happening to our society? What are people's economic realities that is producing this psychological, right, this clearly kind of very disruptive state? And I think that gets left out a lot in the conversation about psychedelics or about mental health treatment, is that, you know, a lot of times it's not just this like something your brain, like your chemistry is off, but it's like, do you feel secure in your job? Are you satisfied with the kind of work you're doing? Are you satisfied with your life? Is your family okay? What kind of healthcare do you have? You know, it's these profound kind of like social questions that I think feed into a lot of the kind of psychological problems, because we're seeing epidemics, right, of anxiety.
Yeah.
So how can it just be that, oh, it's just you that has that problem? You know, that's an untenable kind of argument.
No, it's really crazy, because I pretty much anyone you talk to, any student you talk to as well, if you actually talk to them for long enough, you realize that everyone at some point has some form of like anxiety, and they're on anxiety medications and whatnot. So
exactly. And I think it's society that's sick. It's not just individuals, you know. I think it's like, okay, how much debt are people taking on? How many jobs are they doing? Like, you know, why is our system of education set up in a way where students are competing with each other? Like, could there be other ways of organizing education, like where we are actually prioritizing learning instead of like what kind of grade you're going to get? I was just going to say, if we take all of that into an individual student's anxiety, then, you know, it becomes our collective responsibility.
There's an Indian, you could say, philosopher, thinker. I think you may have heard of his name, is J. Krishnamurti. Have you heard of this guy?
I quoted him right now, actually.
You did? I was just gonna quote him. Like the actual quote from what I remember is like, it is in no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society.
Exactly. Yeah.
And like that is something that I think about a lot, because, you know, like as much as people are saying this is wrong, that's wrong, what is wrong and right is very skewed, because people are skewed.
Totally. Yeah. And I think like, and you know, like this is something that people in Kashmir told me all the time when I would ask them, you know, how are you feeling? Like, what's your like mental state or whatever? And they'd be like, it's impossible to be like healthy in this situation. Like, what are you talking about? You know, like what would it mean to be well adjusted to a militarized zone?
Right.
That's crazy, right? So it's when the situation itself is kind of maddening, like how are people supposed to be healthy? And I think like that's true of the US as well. You know, this situation that we're in, socially, politically, economically, is maddening. You know, it's not an accident that we have. Everyone is kind of experiencing these forms of like psychological distress. It's just that I wish we had a language I wish it was more of a public conversation that this is not your individual problem, but we need to rethink kind of as a society of what we're putting people through, in this intense kind of capitalistic, competitive, individualistic world.
Right. And it's kind of spreading everywhere. Maybe one last thing I wanted to ask you was, speaking of this specific situation of, anxiety and this happening in the US, we already know that there's always been a huge taboo in South Asian countries like India and all the other countries about this topic. Do you see have you seen that changing? Or when, like, I'm pretty sure your parents probably had a very different viewpoint on anxiety and stress compared to, I mean, that doesn't exist in their mind. There is nothing like anxiety in their mind.
Toughen up is the
Which is interesting to think about, because I don't know if they had any sort of anxiety per se. Maybe they just never thought of it like that. They just, just kind of brushed it off, and like whatever it was, they never thought of it like that. So they never kind of expect us to. But do you see that changing in India in that sense? Have you?
I do. But you know what, like another like sort of profound realization I had doing this work was that I realized that it's not that people don't have a way of talking. It's not that they don't know what distress or anxiety or these things are. It's just that their language for talking about it is so different. So, in South Asia, like the main way you talk about psychological problems is as kind of spiritual problems. And you seek like spiritual care, like you go to a guru, or you go to the temple, you go to the shrine, like you go to the mosque, or, in many parts of South Asia, it's an idea that like a spirit has entered your
body. Yes.
And that is the language to talk about psychological distress. It's not a medicalized language. And I think, what is happening is that we're introducing these medical vocabularies into a context, right? And that brings certain kinds of stigma with it, especially if you kind of think about, like one thing I discovered in my research was that, people were scared of psychiatry because of the hospital, because like they knew that in the asylum that people are locked up in there, and that they're locked up for years. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And they get labeled as pagal, as crazy. But they're not, it was never a space of care. It was never a space where people are actually rehabilitated. It was like you are locked up in there and everyone forgets about you. And that's why a lot of people were scared of psychiatry. That's where a lot of the stigma actually came from, was the history of human rights abuses in those institutions, right? Who wants to be locked? Like, I don't want to be locked up in there, So that was really interesting for me to realize, was that psychiatry itself had a role to play in the stigma around mental health care, but also that like, it wasn't that people didn't want to talk about like their feelings, but it was that it was just a totally different language of talking about it. It was like, my soul is distressed, or my heart is distressed, or things like that. It just wasn't the same how we sort of talk about depression or these things.
Right. And that brings that extra layer of like fear and more anxiety. I feel like we need to bring that to like the Eastern world, right?
Yeah.
I feel like the Eastern world had a pretty good hold of these things a few thousand years ago.
Totally.
But now it's all kind of going to flames. Just
because all of those ways of knowing were like delegitimized, like even now spirit possession is diagnosed as a psychiatric disorder a lot of times, or it's just diagnosed as hysteria or these kinds of things. We've like labeled it as something bad. That's not the rational modern way to
logical human being.
Bad. And you need like pharmaceuticals. You don't need to like go to the shrine or these other techniques. So I think that like colonialism and sort of globalization has created this like hierarchy of knowledge where it's only this biological, only this medical knowledge that is valued. And like you were saying, all of these other forms, these traditional forms of knowledge are like seen as superstition,
Yeah, and they're coming back now.
Now
Now there's more study being done on all these things.
Yeah, but it's still like it has, it's like now we'll study like Ayurveda and then we'll say, oh yeah, you were right. Like, yeah, this has like anti-inflammatory properties.
Yeah.
But it's like, why does it always have to be translated through a Western lens? Why can't we just say that, like, look, there's this other form of knowledge and it's valid in its own right? It's a different way of knowing the body, and like I don't need to see a scientific study about it. I should accept like that is logical in its particular context.
It's really funny you say that because I have a friend as well who went for a meditation session, and the like a meditation session over here is taught by a white dude, and like he's teaching us this whole situation, like this whole thing about this past history that our cultural background actually has. And it's such a reversal of roles, like, and it's so weird, it's such a weird thing because in the end, if we just always kind of like had that, acceptance of our own, our own ways and cultures, maybe we would have had a much better route.
Completely. Yeah, I it's like really funny now to me how, because yoga kind of became popular in the US, now it's like, now it has a resurgence,
right.
In India.
Yeah.
And things like that. Yeah, I think, it comes down to this kind of deep self-loathing that colonialism produces, where it's just like such a deep denial of your own indigenous culture, your own values. You like, everything is sort of reflected back to you from the West. And
do you think there's still that hierarchy existing within, like in our minds, like in a typical South Asian or whoever has been anywhere around the world, whoever's been colonized, their mind, is there like a inherent like bias, not bias, like this insecurity kind of yeah?
Absolutely, I think so. And I think the rise of right-wing nationalism, Hindu nationalism, and all of that is in part a response to that. It's a way of reclaiming like some of that indigenous, but of course, it's very destructive in the way that it's doing it, right?
Right.
Because it's rewriting history and doing all of, it's its own form of colonialism, really. That's what it's become. But I think that's where a lot of those movements, the right-wing movements, kind of grew out of, was an attempt to try to respond to this, like, a lot of post-colonial scholars call it like the colonization of the self, because that's really what it is. It's not just about land and territory and resources, but it's about people's psyches, being like taken over, and you're always told that you are not enough, you are not good enough, you always have to be Western, you have to be more rational, you have to be more, it's like our cities are not clean enough, they will never be clean enough, and we beat ourselves up over that, things like that.
And it's weird, last thing, it's really weird that even like my parents, or like the parents are like, I feel like there's a certain sense of there's a compulsion that they had towards their religion that they kind of just brought to them their own, like, so their cultures and their traditions and practices are something they just practice for the sake of practicing, rather than really going into it and knowing what it's all about, which also brings a sense of not knowing what it's really about. And like, every time you do any kind of puja or like any kind of worshipping God, this that, I just see a sense of it's just compulsion. It's just them going on and on every year without knowing really what this is about. Like, why are we doing this? I think if we had a more, and maybe this is maybe we as youth now maybe trying to do, at least I am personally trying to do more of this, and to go back to our roots and try to understand where it actually comes from, what we can actually do with that.
Yeah, I think that's a really amazing thing to do. And I think like every like sort of religious group or every culture kind of has that problem where it's so internal to you that you don't even like realize that it's a thing. Like, it's like taking your shoes off before you enter the house. Like, you don't even realize that's a thing until you encounter households. What? But yeah, I mean, also to that point, what's tragic, right, is that to learn about your own culture, you have to like come to the US. It's like the best scholars of South Asia are in the US. Yeah. All of the biggest thinkers, biggest scholars of India, for example, live in the US and teach in US universities. So that again tells you about the kind of colonial structure of knowledge, right, that we're in. So for you to like learn about Hinduism, you probably need to come to study in a US university.
Interesting.
Because you can't do it in India. We can't blame people, right, for not knowing either, because it's like these things were sort of taken out of the curriculum because they were not valued. They were seen as like, oh, that's your private activity. That's not like something to actually study, right? As
Right. Well, that was a really, really amazing podcast, and I learned a lot from that. Thanks a lot, by the way, for joining in and like telling me all about this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed it. Such awesome questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you.